Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really plunging into one of the most vital, just incredibly beautiful and complex ecosystems out there, coral reefs.
Absolute stunning places.
Totally. And you forget just thinking of them as, pretty backdrops. These are dynamic, living cities built underwater, full of life you can barely even imagine.
Hmm.
Now, you've handed us a whole stack of sources, articles, research papers, fascinating fact sheets, and our mission today is to sort of navigate all that material.
Yeah, cut through the noise a bit.
Exactly. Pull out the essentials, the surprising stuff that'll make you see reefs differently, and just enough practical insight so you feel really informed, but, without getting totally bogged down.
And it's crucial right now. Understanding coral reefs is more important than ever. They're fundamental ecosystems supporting just incredible biodiversity
Huge biodiversity.
and providing services that hundreds of millions of people rely on globally.
Right.
But they're facing, well, unprecedented challenges.
Right.
So this deep dive, using your sources, it's a critical journey into their world. We'll go from the microscopic life that builds them all the way up to the big conservation efforts trying to save them.
Okay, let's start with the basics then. Unpack this fundamental question. When we talk about a coral reef, what exactly are we talking about? It's definitely more than just some rocks in the ocean, right?
Oh, much, much more. When you look at a living reef, you're seeing colonies of tiny animals, polyps they're called.
Polyps, okay.
Think of one polyp like a tiny little soft-bodied anemone. But the key is, these polyps are constantly secreting calcium carbonate.
The hard stuff.
Yes, the hard stuff. Around and beneath themselves. This builds up a hard, protective outer shell, their skeleton. And while most polyps are tiny, the sources actually mention they can vary quite a bit. Some species have polyps up to like 12 inches across.
Wow, that's huge for a polyp.
It is. And the reef structure itself grows because generations of these polyps, plus other organisms like certain algae,
Yeah.
that also deposit calcium carbonate.
Calcareous algae, right?
Exactly. They build layer upon layer. It's this mineral accretion process that creates the massive skeletal framework, pushing the whole coral head and eventually the whole reef upwards and outwards. It takes a long, long time.
They're literally building mountains with their bodies.
That's a great way to put it. Underwater mountains.
That image is powerful. A living, growing architecture. But they don't build alone, do they? There's this partnership, maybe the most crucial one involved.
Absolutely essential. This is the symbiotic relationship with zooxanthellae.
Zooxanthellae, always a mouthful.
It is. But these reef-building corals, the hermatypic ones, they have to live with these tiny, single-celled photosynthetic organisms. They're a type of algae, basically,
And they live inside the coral.
right inside the polyp's tissues. It's a fascinating deal they have. The coral gives the zooxanthellae a safe place to live and the ingredients for photosynthesis, like CO2.
Okay.
And in return, the zooxanthellae use sunlight to produce energy-rich sugars, which the coral polyp then uses as its main food source. Like 90% or more of its energy can come from this.
Incredible. So it's solar-powered coral, essentially.
Pretty much. And this partnership is so fundamental that these hermatypic corals can only live in what's called the photic zone.
The sunny part of the ocean.
Exactly. The upper layer where enough sunlight gets through for the algae to do their photosynthesis.
Yeah.
Generally, that's no deeper than about 70 meters.
So sunlight fuels the algae, which feeds the coral. Amazing system. And the sources, they reveal something really interesting about these zooxanthellae. They're not all the same, are they? And that difference matters.
Yes, that's a really key insight.
Yeah.
There are actually 8 major genetic groups, or clades, of these Symbiodinium phylotypes. Clades A through D are the ones we know the most about.
Okay, A through D.
And what's fascinating is they react differently to things like light and temperature, and they offer different benefits to the coral. Take clade A, for instance. You find clade A much more often in the warmer, brighter, shallow waters, and the sources explain why. Clade A can produce these things called mycosporine-like amino acids.
Oh, and natural sunscreen.
Exactly. They absorb UV radiation using a glycerin derivative. So corals with clade A are much better adapted to handle the intense sun and heat you get in the shallows.
So the symbionts themselves are adapted. That makes sense for the sunny spots. What about the ones living deeper down, where it's darker and cooler?
Good question. That's where you'll more often find clades B and C. They're adapted to lower light, cooler water,
Okay.
but that adaptation makes them less resilient when things change, especially when the ocean warms up.
Right.
Because they're structured to soak up every bit of light in dim conditions, they're actually more vulnerable to UV damage if temperatures rise. compared to clade A with its built-in protection.
But wait, there's one clade that kind of breaks that pattern even deeper down.
Precisely. That's clade D. The sources specifically call out clade D because, even though it's found deeper, it has shown significantly higher temperature tolerance.
Really?
Yes, and better survival rates during these modern coral bleaching events we've been seeing, especially compared to B and C. It shows there's this inherent variation in resilience just among the symbionts themselves, which is super important for understanding how corals might or might not adapt to climate change.
That level of detail is amazing. It shows the hidden complexity within the coral. So we've got polyps building with calcium carbonate fueled by their algae partners. But what else shapes the reef? It's not just building, is it?
No, it's not just building up. The reef is also constantly being reshaped by processes we call bioerosion.
Bioerosion, breaking down the structure.
Exactly. It's the breakdown of that hard reef structure. It happens through physical forces like waves pounding on it, but also through living organisms.
Like fish.
Yes. Key bioeroders include grazing fish, parrotfish are a big one. They munch algae off the reef surface, but they scrape off bits of the coral skeleton too.
Okay.
Sea urchins also graze algae and erode the rock. And even sponges, they can bore into the skeleton, chemically dissolving parts of it.
Wow, sponges too.
Yep. So these organisms break down the skeletons into smaller bits, fragments, gravel, fine sand.
And that material goes somewhere.
It does. It doesn't just disappear. Currents and gravity move it around. It settles into cracks and spaces in the reef, or it accumulates in calmer spots like lagoons, forming those sandy bottoms you see.
Oh, okay.
So this cycle of breakdown and redistribution is actually a natural, important part of the reef's geology. It contributes to the overall structure and sediment production.
A constant process of building and sculpting. Fascinating. Now, if you travel around the world, coral reefs don't all look the same. The sources highlight the main types or shapes they take. Let's dive into those.
Okay, let's start with the most common one, the fringing reef.
Fringing, like a fringe on the coast.
Exactly. These reefs grow directly from the shore, following the coastline. Often there's just a narrow, shallow channel or maybe a small lagoon between the reef crest and the land.
Right.
They can stretch for kilometers along a coast. Usually they start forming right at the low water mark and then grow outwards towards the sea.
How wide do they get?
The sources say usually less than 100 meters, but some can be hundreds of meters wide. And over time, on older fringing reefs, erosion can deepen the inner part near the shore, creating a proper lagoon that runs parallel to the coast.
Oh, okay.
These lagoons can get pretty big, over 100 meters wide and several meters deep. And the sources specifically mention the Red Sea fringing reefs as some of the best developed in the world.
Red Sea. Okay, so moving further out from the coast, then we get the really big ones, the barrier reefs.
Barrier reefs are just spectacular. The key difference is they're separated from the mainland or island shore by a significant channel or lagoon.
Much bigger than with fringing reefs.
Oh, yeah. Often several kilometers wide and deep, too, maybe 30 to 70 meters deep. While they might look like a later stage of a fringing reef, their origin is different.
How so?
They're offshore outer edge forms way out in open water, not attached to the coast. The main theory is that either the seabed slowly sank or sea level rose over geological time. And the reef just kept growing upwards, keeping pace with the water depth, while the land behind it effectively sank or got submerged relative to the reef.
So it takes a lot longer to form.
Considerably longer, yes. Which makes them much rarer worldwide compared to fringing reefs.
And the most famous example, everyone knows this one.
Has to be the Australian Great Barrier Reef. It's the biggest, best-known example, just immense. You can see it from space.
Incredible.
But the sources also list other major ones, like the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef system that runs along Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, Honduras.
Right, second largest.
And the New Caledonian Barrier Reef. You also find big ones off places like Providencia, Mayotte, and parts of Indonesia and New Guinea.
Okay. Next up, the ones that seem to pop up more independently, platform reefs?
Biform reefs, yeah. Sometimes called bank or table reefs. These are interesting because they don't necessarily need a coastline nearby.
So they can form anywhere.
Pretty much anywhere. The seabed rises close enough to the surface for those reef-building corals to get started. So you find them on the continental shelf.
Like in the Great Barrier Reef Complex.
Exactly. The sources mention the Swain and Capricorn groups in the southern GBR, way offshore.
Yeah.
But you also find them in the middle of the open ocean, like some of the northern mascarines in the Indian Ocean, thousands of kilometers from land.
Wow.
And unlike fringing and barrier reefs that mainly grow outwards from shore, platform reefs tend to grow outwards in all directions from where they start.
What do they look like?
variable size, hundreds of meters to kilometers across, often oval or elongated. Parts can reach the surface, forming sandy bits or little islands, and they can develop a lagoon in the middle, too.
And the sources mention smaller ones within atolls called patch reefs. Are those related?
Yes, exactly.
Mm.
Patch reefs are basically a type of platform reef. They're described as common, isolated, small outcrops. You typically find them scattered inside a lagoon or a sheltered bay.
Little islands of reef?
Kind of, often circular, surrounded by sand or seagrass. And there's a cool detail the sources mention about patch reefs and seagrass. Sometimes you see a grazing halo around them.
A halo.
Yeah, a ring of bare sand. It happens because the fish living on the patch reef swim out to eat in the seagrass, but they don't stray too far from the safety of the reef.
Ah, makes sense.
Platform reefs can also line up, sometimes following underwater ridges or old barrier reef remnants. The sources use the Red Sea coast near Jeddah as an example of this linear pattern. And another twist, old platform reefs can erode in the middle and end up looking like atolls. They call them pseudo-atolls.
Pseudo-atolls.
Yeah, you'd need a detailed look to tell them apart from true atolls formed the other way.
Which brings us to the final iconic type, the atolls.
Atolls or atoll reefs, defined as a more or less circular or continuous barrier reef that completely surrounds a central lagoon, but crucially, without a central island.
And the classic story is they form from volcanoes.
That's the widely accepted theory, going back to Darwin. They usually start as fringing reefs around a volcanic island. Over millions of years, the volcano erodes and sinks below sea level. As it sinks, the coral reef keeps growing upwards, staying near the surface. Eventually, the island is gone, leaving just the ring of coral around the lagoon where the island used to be.
Or it could be just seabed sinking or sea level rising, too.
Yes, those simpler processes can also form them.
Yeah.
They're really common in the tropical South Pacific and Indian Oceans.
Where specifically?
Places like the Caroline Islands, Cook Islands, French Polynesia, Marshall Islands, Micronesia in the Pacific, and in the Indian Ocean, think of the Maldives.
The whole country is atolls, right?
Exactly, 26 of them. Also the Chagos Islands, Seychelles, and Cocos Island.
Amazing structures. The sources did list a couple of other minor variants. Anything interesting there?
Just briefly, they mentioned apron reefs, sort of short, sloping reefs, maybe like an early fringing reef stage, often sticking out from a point of land.
Okay.
Also, drying reefs, parts that stick out of the water at low tide. And a specific Red Sea term, habilis, for reefs that are hidden just below the surface, making them a hazard, comes from the Arabic for unborn.
Habilis. Interesting. It's incredible how many shapes these things take. Okay, so now we know the different types of reefs. Let's put on our virtual scuba gear and explore the different zones within a reef system.
All right, let's visualize it. Coming in from the open ocean, especially over a continental shelf, you might first hit the off-reef floor.
The surrounding seabed.
Yeah, the relatively shallow seafloor around the main reef, often sandy, and it can have important seagrass meadows. These are key feeding areas for reef fish that plop off the reef to forage.
But not all reefs have this.
Right. Reefs around oceanic islands and atolls usually just drop off steeply into deep water, so they lack this shallow off-reef floor.
Ah, so that steep drop, that's its own zone.
Exactly. That's the reef's drop-off. The upper part, say the first 50 meters down, is prime habitat. The cliff face offers loads of shelter in cracks and crevices for fish.
Yeah.
And being exposed to open water means lots of plankton drifting by, so it's great for plankton-feeding fish. This zone is really characteristic of those oceanic island and atoll reefs.
Okay. And what about the main slope, the bit facing the ocean?
That's the reef face, often seen as the heart of the reef, usually the most diverse part. It sits above the off-reef floor or the drop-off.
Why so diverse?
The complex 3D structure from corals and calcareous algae creates endless little microhabitats. Hiding spots, surfaces to grow on, different light levels, currents. Plus, all the invertebrates and tiny algae living on the reef surface provide a huge food base.
And those spur and groove things.
Right. Common on the reef face, especially the forereef exposed to waves. You get these ridges of coral, the spurs, separated by sandy channels, the grooves. They help channel water and move sediment down and away from the living coral.
Got it. And finally, the flatter bit, maybe towards the shore or a lagoon.
That would be the reef flat. Usually shallow, often sandy-bottomed, behind the main reef crest. You find lots of coral rubble here, broken bits. If there's a lagoon, the reef flat acts as a buffer zone, protecting the calmer lagoon waters. If there's no lagoon, it's the flat, sometimes rocky area between the reef and the shore. The sources say fish definitely use it when it's there, probably for feeding and finding different kinds of shelter.
So many distinct neighborhoods in one system, and it's not just coral polyps living there. Reefs are famous for biodiversity. The sources highlighted some other key residents.
Oh, the web of life is incredibly complex. Beyond the fish everyone thinks of, the sources really point out the role of seabirds.
Seabirds on coral reefs.
Absolutely. Especially on isolated atolls. They provide crucial habitat for nesting seabirds, some endangered. The example given is just staggering. Midway Atoll in the Pacific.
Midway.
Yeah, it supports nearly 3 million seabirds. That includes 2/3 of the entire world population of Laysan albatross, 1.5 million birds, and 1/3 of the black-footed albatross.
3 million birds on one atoll.
Incredible, isn't it? 17 different species live there. It shows how vital these remote reef systems are as safe breeding grounds. The rarest is the short-tailed albatross, which was almost wiped out by hunting.
Wow. Okay, seabirds. And you mentioned sponges earlier breaking down rock, but the sources said they do something else really surprising.
They do. It's a really cool concept called the sponge loop. Sponges are everywhere on reefs, very diverse.
So the sponge loop, what's that?
Okay, so corals release a lot of dissolved organic matter, basically energy-rich goo, into the water.
Okay.
A lot of that energy could just drift away and be lost from the reef ecosystem. But sponges are brilliant at capturing this dissolved stuff right out of the water column.
They filter it out?
Exactly. Then they process it and release it back as particulate matter, tiny food particles, or waste that other animals living nearby or within the reef framework can eat.
So they're recycling.
Precisely. They take dissolved nutrients that are hard for most animals to use and turn them into accessible food. This is super important in the nutrient-poor waters where reefs thrive. It helps keep resources on the reef, enriching what the sources call a potential marine desert.
The reef's own internal recycling plant. That's amazing. We also talked about grazers like parrotfish and urchins shaping the reef, but their role goes beyond just landscaping, right?
Oh, absolutely critical. They are ecological linchpins. By grazing algae, they stop it from overgrowing and smothering the corals, which grow much more slowly.
Right, keeping things in balance.
And the sources give a great example. The recovery of the long-spined sea urchin, Diadema antillarum, in the Caribbean. They had a massive die-off in the 80s.
I remember hearing about that.
Well, where Diadema started recovering, researchers saw a big drop in the amount of macroalgae covering the reef. And crucially, less algae meant more space and light for baby corals. They found an increase in juvenile coral abundance where the urchins came back.
So the grazers directly help coral recovery.
Definitely. It shows how powerful their influence is in maintaining that balance needed for reefs to be resilient.
Any other interesting animals or behaviors that the sources mention?
A couple of neat tidbits. Some surprising diets.
Hmm.
Like certain sea snakes, they mentioned Aposaurus aduxi, and the genus Emidocephalus have evolved to eat only fish eggs.
Only eggs. Wow.
Very specialized.
Hmm.
And hawksbill sea turtles. They're known for spongivory eating sponges, which most animals avoid because they're tough and often chemically defended.
Huh. Hawksbills eat sponges. Didn't know that. Shows the diversity of niches.
Exactly. Everyone finds their way to make a living.
It's incredible. And beyond this natural wonder, coral reefs provide just immense value to us humans and the planet.
Incredibly valuable,
Yeah.
ecologically and economically. The sources throw out some huge numbers. The global economic value is estimated somewhere between US $29.8 billion and $375 billion per year.
That's a massive range, but even the low end is huge.
It's enormous, and it reflects how hard it is to calculate all the services. But the key takeaway is that an estimated 500 million people worldwide directly benefit from what coral reefs provide.
500 million people. What are the main ways they provide that value?
The sources break it down into three main services: tourism, fisheries, and coastline protection.
Okay.
Reefs attract millions of tourists, diving, snorkeling, generating huge revenue. They support incredibly productive fisheries, providing food and jobs, and they act as natural breakwaters.
Protecting the coast from storms and waves.
Exactly, dissipating wave energy. The sources even put a price on losing that service. Destroying just 1 square kilometer of reef could cost between $137,000 and $1.2 million over 25 years, just in terms of dealing with increased erosion and storm damage.
Wow. That's a clear economic argument for protection.
Definitely. And the sources mention specific efforts to quantify this, like the World Resources Institute, WRI, working with Caribbean countries.
Right.
They mentioned St. Lucia, Tobago, Belize, the Dominican Republic. The Belize study estimated the value of their reef and mangrove services at $395 to $559 million.
Huge numbers.
And the goal of these studies is to translate that ecological value into economic terms that policymakers can use to make better decisions about coastal management.
So they're not just pretty, they're economic powerhouses and natural shields. But unfortunately, they are under serious, serious pressure.
Sadly, yes. The sources paint a grim picture of the threats, many driven by us. We can group them. First, direct physical damage.
Like what?
Destructive fishing.
Cool.
Bottom trawling, especially on deep-sea corals on seamounts, just wipes them out. Coral mining, literally removing reef for construction materials. They mention Wakatobi Marine Park suffering from this.
Mining coral.
And blast fishing.
Yeah.
Using dynamite. It just shatters everything.
Horrible. And even tourism can cause problems.
Ironically, yes. Concentrating lots of boats and people on reefs can impact coral health, more disease, metabolic stress, likely from physical bumps and general disturbance. And there's that specific chemical threat. Sunscreen. Certain chemicals in many sunscreens can trigger viral infections in the zooxanthellae, causing bleaching.
Just from sunscreen washing off swimmers?
Seems so, yes. And then there are the threats from land.
Runoff?
Big time. Terrestrial runoff. Sediment from land clearing or farming washes onto reefs, smothers corals, blocks sunlight. Excess nutrients from fertilizers and sewage fuel algal blooms that outcompete corals.
Okay.
Plus other pollutants from cities, poor coastal water quality. It all adds up.
And then the really big one, the global one, climate change. How do the sources describe its impact?
It's the major crisis, hitting reefs in two main ways. First,
Right.
warming oceans. When water gets too warm for too long, that crucial symbiosis breaks down.
The coral kicks out the algae.
Exactly. Expels the zooxanthellae, that's coral, bleaching. The coral turns white because you see the skeleton through the clear tissue. If it stays warm, the coral starves and dies.
And bleaching is happening more often.
Much more frequently and severely worldwide due to rising temperatures. The second hit is ocean acidification.
More acidic oceans.
Yes. The ocean absorbs a lot of the extra CO2 we put in the atmosphere, and that lowers its pH, makes it more acidic.
And that's bad for coral skeletons.
Very bad.
Mm-hmm.
It makes it harder for corals and other things like shellfish and coralline algae to build and maintain their calcium carbonate skeletons. That process, calcification, is fundamental to reef growth.
Right.
The sources even draw a really sobering comparison to the end Permian mass extinction, suggesting today's acidification could be similar in its potential impact.
Wow. That's serious. Any other atmospheric links mentioned?
Just an interesting note that historical aerosol emissions, tiny particles from human activity, might have influenced Caribbean coral growth patterns in the past, maybe by slightly changing regional climate or sunlight. Another complex interaction.
So you add it all up, local pollution, destructive fishing, warming, acidification. What's the overall state of reefs?
The picture is stark. The sources state global coral cover has dropped by roughly half since the 1950s. Half. It's a dramatic decline, driven by all these cumulative threats, with climate change-driven bleaching becoming a major killer. It really underlines the urgency.
It sounds incredibly daunting, but there are people and projects fighting back, right? The sources cover conservation and restoration efforts too, offering some hope.
They do.
Yeah.
And it's vital to look at what's being done. A major tool is Marine Protected Areas, MPAs.
Protected zones.
Right. Areas with rules to limit human impact, protect habitats, manage fishing. Now, the sources say there's debate about how effective they always are.
Oh.
Some studies don't find big differences inside versus outside certain MPAs, and sometimes they cause local conflict if not done well. But when they're well managed, they can be powerful.
How so?
Promoting better fisheries, protecting habitat, generating revenue, like in the Phoenix Islands. The key, the sources stress, is clear management, good enforcement, and enough funding.
Okay. Beyond MPAs, other types of protection.
Yeah, reefs can be designated as biosphere reserves, marine parks, national monuments, or get international status as World Heritage Sites.
Does that help?
It can bring attention and resources. The sources list several World Heritage Sites protecting major reefs. Belize's Barrier Reef, Sian Canan in Mexico, parts of the Galapagos, the Great Barrier Reef itself, Henderson Island, Palau, Papahanaumokuakea in Hawaii. Different labels, different protection levels.
What about more hands-on stuff? Coral farming.
Yes, coral aquaculture or farming or gardening. It's a rapidly growing field and really promising for restoration. The basic idea is growing coral fragments, like little coral seeds, in nurseries.
Nurseries, like underwater gardens.
They can be. Like structures hanging in the water, coral trees or tanks on land. You grow the corals there, protecting them during their vulnerable baby stages.
Right.
Then, once they're bigger and stronger, you transplant them back onto degraded reefs. The sources say nurseries are probably the most widespread and arguably effective restoration method right now. They're relatively straightforward, and we're seeing good results.
And there was that technique mentioned that massively speeds things up.
Ah, yes, microfragmentation. This is really exciting stuff, developed at Mote Marine Lab in Florida.
Microfragmentation, what is it?
Instead of using larger coral pieces, they cut the coral into much smaller fragments, like only a centimeter square, using special saws.
Tiny pieces.
Super tiny. And they found this triggers a healing response that makes the coral grow way faster. The example was Orbitella faviolata, a slow boulder coral. Using microfragmentation, it grew 6.5 times its size in just 2 years. Normally, that would take decades.
2 years versus decades. Incredible.
It allowed Mote to produce 25,000 corals in 1 year, and they put 10,000 onto reefs in the Florida Keys. Huge scale-up potential.
Wow. And this connects to fusion.
Exactly. The other big discovery was if you plant multiple microfragments from the same parent coral close together, they fuse back into one bigger colony.
Because they recognize each other genetically.
Precisely. Corals from different parents fight, but clones fuse. This means you can grow a large coral head, something that might take 25, maybe 75 years naturally in just 2 years, by fusing these microfragments. And that fused colony acts as one more resilient organism.
That's genuinely game-changing for restoration timelines. So growing the coral faster is one thing. What about giving them places to grow?
Also key. Restoration often involves creating or adding substrates. Sometimes it's artificial reefs using things like old tires, sunken ships, subway cars.
Subway cars? Seriously?
Seriously. Though repurposed materials can sometimes have downsides, more targeted are things like concrete reef balls. Interestingly, even structures like oil rigs can become accidental reefs over time.
Huh.
And when planting farmed corals, you need to attach them using pins, underwater glue, even thread for delicate ones.
And the type of surface matters.
It does. A study in the Philippines near Ticao Island showed that substrate complexity influences how well coral larvae settle.
More complex is better.
Medium complexity actually did best in their study, a mix of rough and smooth rocks with a fence structure. And the larvae clearly preferred the rougher rock surfaces.
Okay.
And the really hopeful part, after only 1 year, those restored sites were already boosting local fisheries. It suggests cost-effective restoration can work, especially if the sites are protected.
What if existing coral is just in the wrong place, like in a channel being dredged? Can you move it?
Yes, relocation is another tool. The sources give a case study from Oahu, Hawaii. The university moved coral from a boat channel being damaged by dredging.
How did it go?
They carefully transplanted patches to a nearby spot. They reported little to no damage or death from the move itself, and the corals grew well on hard rock at the new site, even attaching to the wires holding them. They concluded it worked well without negative side effects.
Okay, good to know. Now, there was also something that sounded almost sci-fi, involving genetics.
Right, the idea of using heat-tolerant symbionts or even gene therapy. The goal is making corals more resistant to warming oceans by tweaking their zooxanthellae partners.
How would that work?
Several approaches are being looked at. Trying to force acclimatization, hoping corals pick up tougher symbionts naturally. Identifying and maybe shifting the mix of symbiont clades in young corals towards more tolerant ones. Selective breeding, basically. Stress testing corals in labs and breeding the survivors.
Yeah.
And the most advanced idea, genetically modifying the zooxanthellae themselves for heat tolerance, then getting them back into corals. That's the toughest, but potentially very powerful.
Wow. From gardening to gene editing, it's an amazing range. And the sources also had some practical things individuals can do, right? From that reef-safe traveler bit.
Yes, definitely. Concrete actions. One big one. Become a citizen scientist. For local programs, organizations, foundations, even hotels or parks might run them. You can help collect data, monitor reefs, maybe even help with nursery work. A quick online search for Coral Reef Citizen Science, plus your location, might find opportunities.
Okay, contribute to the science. What about behavior around roofs?
Boat responsibly. Huge. Choose operators who use moorings, not anchors that smash coral. Stow your trash properly so nothing blows overboard. And they suggest avoiding operators who feed wildlife. It messes up natural behavior.
Good tips, and a simple one that helps fund the work.
Pay the fees. Support conservation directly. Pay user fees for marine parks. Make donations to good reef conservation groups. That money is absolutely vital for research, enforcement, restoration, all of it. These programs need funding.
Makes sense. And lastly, that cool sound experiment.
Yeah, the auditory simulation. On damaged bits of the Great Barrier Reef, they played recordings of healthy reef sounds.
To attract fish back.
Exactly. And it worked. Playing the sounds doubled the fish attraction rate compared to silent sites and increased the number of species by 50%, using sound as a cue to kickstart recovery. Clever stuff.
Wow. We have really covered a huge amount of ground today. A true deep dive into coral reefs, thanks to all those sources you provided. We went from the tiny polyps and their crucial algae partners.
Learning about the different clades, A, B, C, D.
Right, and how they build these incredible structures, fringing, barrier, platform, atoll reefs. We explored the different zones, the drop-offs, the faces, the flats. We met other residents, the millions of seabirds on Midway, the vital recycling sponges doing the sponge loop, the algae-munching urchins,
Can't forget the egg-eating sea snakes.
or the sponge-eating turtles. We looked at their immense value, billions of dollars, protecting hundreds of millions of people, and then the harsh reality of the threats.
Destructive fishing, pollution, runoff, and the big ones, warming, acidification. The 50% decline since the 50s.
Sobering stuff. But then we saw the hope and the action. MPAs, World Heritage Sites, coral gardening, that amazing microfragmentation and fusion.
Growing reefs in 2 years instead of 70.
Creating new substrates, moving corals, even exploring genetic tools and using sound. It's a really complex picture.
It truly is. Understanding those details, the symbiont vulnerabilities, the sponge loop mechanics, how microfragmentation works, it gives you such a richer perspective than just hearing reefs are dying.
Yeah.
You see the challenges and the potential solutions.
It really makes you realize how interconnected everything is and how many different angles there are to tackling the problem, from global policy down to tiny fragments of coral.
Precisely. The sources laid out the biology, the ecology, the economics, and the human actions, both the harm and the potential healing.
So based on everything we've unpacked in this deep dive, here's a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Given this huge range of threats, especially climate change, and this equally diverse range of conservation tools, from massive protected areas and potential gene editing, down to local hands-on restoration and individual choices, what balance of global action, local efforts, and technological innovation do you think holds the most realistic promise for the future of coral reefs in our changing world? Thank you so much for providing the sources that fueled this deep dive. We genuinely hope this conversation helps you feel truly well-informed about the incredible world of coral reefs.
And we absolutely encourage you to keep exploring. Dig deeper into whatever caught your interest today. There's always more to learn about these vital ecosystems.